Another one of our fortnightly chats. This time we've got some questions. The first question is concerning whether training for freediving should emphasize aerobic training or anaerobic training. What's the place of aerobic and what's the place of anaerobic? And if there's any downside to aerobic training. So here's the take. Let's venture back into history a little bit to understand that the answer to this question actually has come out of cumulative experience. Back in 2002, I attended a course in English of the Apnea Academy given by Umberto, and an instructor's course. And at that time, the Italian universities who were doing experiments on him and also advising him about his training were very concerned about this subject. As you know, nothing is either purely aerobic or purely anaerobic. Very little. The most anaerobic event that we can think of immediately is probably the 100-meter sprint in the Olympics. The other end of the scale, we have the marathon, which is supposed to be purely an aerobic event. Let's go to the definition at the moment. Aerobic means that you're getting sufficient oxygen during the whole time of the performance. Anaerobic means that you have, you're eating into oxygen reserves and you're exerting yourself too much for the amount of oxygen you're taking in. It is said that the 1500 meters is about half and half. Okay, so that gives us an idea of what they were looking at. So they were trying to find out really how much of a free dive, a depth free dive, was in fact aerobic and how much was anaerobic. Eventually this became academic, because really it doesn't matter, because basically what happens is that your fitness level for freediving is determined basically by your anaerobic capabilities. This is what's necessary for freediving. All of us over the years came to the same conclusion. Aerobic before, about the same, about 2002, the idea was that you did 12 weeks aerobic training, then you began mixed training for 2 months, which would be sort of half aerobic training and interval training, or beginning anaerobic training, and then followed by 2 months, I beg your pardon, of purely anaerobic training. We've kind of discarded that idea today, and we go as quickly as we possibly can into anaerobic training, which to me makes a lot of sense. If we think about it, aerobic exercise is all about getting sufficient exercise for the duration of the exercise that you're doing. Well, that doesn't happen in a free dive. So what are we doing getting the body accustomed to getting a sufficient supply of oxygen? It's not the direction that we want to go in. If you are very, very unfit today, and I mean really couch potato unfit, yes, you probably will not be able to do anaerobic training at the beginning. So you need a certain amount to get into a basic minimum condition before you begin your anaerobic training. How much? Well, that depends exactly how unfit you are, your age, and several other factors. However, we want as quickly as possible to get into anaerobic training. That's our objective. If you're talking about dry training, one of the most superb exercises is, of course, hill repeats. We have a very special table that we've worked out for that. I'll give it to you now. I may have given it to you before, but those of you who didn't catch it, I'll do it very quickly. We find a steep hill, and before we begin to run up the hill, we do about 12 exercises of light jogging on the flat, and we do stretching. Then we go straight into hill repeats. Hill repeats mean that you start at the bottom of the hill and you sprint up the hill flat out, taking no prisoners, as flat out as is humanly possible for 20 seconds. You then walk down to the beginning, and the moment you've hit the beginning, you sprint up the hill again. Now you do this 4 times, only 4 repetitions in total. It's a very, very, very strong exercise. At first, after you've sprinted up and after your walk down to the bottom, you may be obliged to take a 30-second rest if your fitness level isn't up to it. Okay, but you try and cut that down as much as possible. Sprint up. Now each time that you sprint up, you try to go further in the 20 seconds than your last time. Now that's in the first week. You only do this exercise twice a week, not more than that. You don't add frills onto this exercise, like carrying a rucksack with 50 kilos on your back while you're trying to do it. All you do is do yourself damage. And it has no merit to it at all. It doesn't give you anything to try and make the exercise harder. It's hard enough as it is, believe me. And it'll get you as fit as you can possibly be. So the first week you do the exercise twice, 4 repetitions each time. And don't forget, after you've finished the exercise, you need a cool down, which is jogging again for about 12 minutes, and then a long stretching session. The second week, you add another repetition, making altogether 5 repetitions. The third week, 6 repetitions. The fourth week, that's 1 month, 7 repetitions. Now we don't go higher than that. The next month, we do the unexpected. Instead of sprinting up the hill for 20 seconds, we sprint up the hill for 10 seconds. It's actually a lot harder because you're going much faster, it's much more intense, and you've got much less recuperation, because to come back from a sprint where you've only sprinted 10 seconds doesn't take that long before you have to begin again very quickly. And again, you build it from the beginning, 4 repetitions the first week of the second month, 5 for the second week, 6 for the third week, 7 for the last week, and that's it. You're going to be very, very, very fit if you do that. In the swimming pool, it's sprints. Depending on the length of your swimming pool, we have a 50-meter swimming pool, so it's 50-meter sprints and with reduced intervals. And this can get, if you reduce the intervals a lot, it can get actually into lactic training. For those of you who are very, very high in dynamic, of course the classic is 3 repeats of 100 meters. And doing it quickly with relatively short intervals. Those of you who are beginners or intermediate, might do that in a 25-meter pool, but the sprints have to be flat out and the intervals short. This is the basic principle of that exercise. Lactic training, that's to increase your resistance to lactic acid, is essential for deep free divers. On top of that, the other thing is anaerobic training is absolutely essential for reducing your production of lactic acid and also for your general overall conditioning, cardiac conditioning in that. That's more or less the picture there in very, very short terms. So basically what we want to do is, let me just repeat that, go as soon as we possibly can, as soon as our bodies will allow us to, into anaerobic training. And here is a warning. When I say twice a week, I mean twice a week. One of the biggest diseases amongst elite athletes today is overtraining. We all know the symptoms. You hit a wall and you start going backwards. So for all you headbangers out there, take a warning. Rest is an absolutely indispensable component of training. And you need it. So is hydration. If you're going to train very intensely, particularly on sprints, it is very, very important that after you've exercised, that you do a long, easy stretching session. It's critical. Otherwise, you're just going to be cranking yourselves up, and again, you're going to be undoing an awful lot of the good that you've done. Let me check if I've got another question come in, and then I'll go and answer one that's already been put to me. Anything come in? Okay. Now, one of the things that we're going to talk about today is the subject of ventilation. This seems to be a subject that has changed in fashion an awful lot. An old friend of mine is a gentleman by the name of Bob Croft. I've sat in Bob's living room with him watching his preparation and his world records. And there's no question that Bob was doing what we would definitely classify as hyperventilation today. Let me go back to a medical definition that is usually accepted, and that is that anything above breathing to tidal volume and more than 12 breaths a minute classifies as hyperventilation. That's supposed to be normal breathing, like when we're sitting in a relaxed position, or very, very light exercise. Okay. Now, after we got over the very early ideas about hyperventilation, the idea that first came into people's minds, and I think it probably came out of the fishing world, was that I think we can see it very well illustrated in The Big Blue, if anybody's seen it there. If you've seen the long version, you see the Japanese team coming and going boom, and passing out. Okay. Hyperventilation has, of course, an awful lot of downsides. And actually, as far as I can make out, absolutely no upside whatsoever. Let's examine what they are. It puts up the heart rate. It makes the blood more acidic in a way that it will not release the oxygen that it has in saturation in the blood for use either by the brain or by the muscles. So, very bad news. And then the biggest news is that CO2, which is being washed out of the body, is actually your alarm clock. It's not an enemy. It tells you how near to your present maximum you're getting. And we need it. In fact, it is much easier to train to withstand the discomfort of CO2, the contractions, than it is simply to wash it out of the body and then get very near to hypoxia before we feel any discomfort. So hyperventilation, we all agreed at a certain point, was an extremely poor idea. But then we started to invent our own definitions of hyperventilation. We considered it okay if we breathed very deeply but slowly. Then we thought we were not hyperventilating. Actually, if we examine what happens in the blood, we are. So here's the ticket. If you put an oximeter on your finger and you measure oxygen saturation, in a normal course of life, we're probably at least 98% saturated. So we really don't need more than 2 big breaths at the most, or even 1, to fully saturate with oxygen. So, hey, what was the point of ventilation then? The point of ventilation, we have to go back in history again to yoga and the yoga masters. They discovered that breathing has relationship to mood and to brain activity. If you're in the, taking an extreme example, if you're in the flight or fight mode, you'll find that your breathing becomes rapid and upper chest breathing. It's getting you ready for an activity here. If you look at the great masters of breathing, every infant, you see their little tummies rising and falling, rhythmically and smoothly, without pause between inhalation and exhalation. You don't have to look for the masters sitting on top of a Himalaya. They are the masters. Before we screw up our kids by giving them computers and other wonderful toys where they're going to sit there in front of the computer all day playing stupid games, we find that until a certain age, their breathing is perfect and completely natural. A lot of our training initially in learning how to breathe, we have to go back to the yogic idea of the 3-part, or if you like it, the 2-part breath, abdominal and then intercostal, and filling not only from bottom to top, but from front to back. But here's the ticket. Do we breathe like that all the time that we're ventilating? No. We should be looking for that infant's sleepy feeling. Very relaxed abdominal breathing. Now, William Trowbridge wrote a very good article about this thing, which I can recommend. There are points where, fine points, where I would very, very slightly veer from his basic dictum here. His thing is that it should be shallow. I think it should be, look, when you go to sleep, your breathing is not shallow. It's deeper than when you're sitting in front of a computer screen or just sitting and resting or reading a book or watching television. When you start going to sleep, it's abdominal breathing, but it's a little bit deeper. And that's nothing, nowhere near full lung, but that's, I think, what we should be aiming at. So observe yourself. When you start getting sleepy, don't try to change your breathing. Watch it and imitate it. Now the last breath, yes, that should be a full one. And for those of you who need it, of course, it's followed by packing. We talked about that. Packing again, basically today in very short terms, most people agree for depth, will be just trying to pack to the same amount that you would actually get by taking a full breath on the surface. Now, obviously, it depends on your position in the water, how you're ventilating, and how much you pack. If you're on your back, lying completely on your back, you're taking a much bigger breath anyway, because your diaphragm is not going to have to work against water pressure, which it would do if we were floating in an upright position to the collarbone level. So my suggestion is moderate it a bit. To remind you, packing has its downside, which for deep diving is 3 important factors. 1, overcoming much more buoyancy in the first part of the dive, which might be to, let's say, 15 meters or 20 meters. The next downside is, of course, much stronger narcosis at depth, and it may come on earlier because of packing. The other downside to packing can be that if you're doing deep sled dives, of course, the risk of decompression sickness. These are important points with this. So, recap, breathing just about close to tidal volume, maybe very, very slightly more, just as if you were going to sleep. Last breath, the full 3-part breath, and then followed, if you like, by packing. So that's our recommendation with that. The other thing is, how long should I ventilate? Like that. To me, the purpose of that ventilation is to set up the right mental state, to set up the right brainwave pattern. Now, as in most things, this is a question of training. The French did some experiments with this, and I think have some very good ideas on the subject. To try and minimize it, to try and get into the zone with a minimum amount of time. Really, you don't need the full 2 minutes for this. The spoiled diver is one who is fighting the clock. when the countdown is going on, he's saying, oh my God, I'm not ready yet, I'm not ready yet, I need more air, I need more air, I'm going deep, I need more air. Already he's giving himself negative suggestion in going into the dive. The French used to, I don't know whether they still do it, but at one time they had a wonderful habit of when you were training for a dive and you were on the line and you were trying to relax, interfering with the person. Hey, did you see that fish going by? Or some other ridiculous thing like that. The idea was that you had to snap back into the zone immediately. And the worst thing that you can do is to say, okay, I took 12 breaths for 40 meters. Today I'm going to be doing 45 meters or whatever it is. I'm going to double the amount of breaths. I need more air for it. You don't need more air. You need only 1 to 2 breaths, maximum breaths to totally oxygenate. All the rest is the speed at which you train yourself to get into the right mental condition. And the quicker we can do that, and the more resistance we have to interruptions, that means to say that we don't allow things to interfere with us, or if they do, very briefly, we return immediately to being in the zone. And if we train that way, we're going to be very strong mentally, and ventilation and preparation for the dive will be optimal. So, that's all for that one. I'm just going to check again to see if we have any questions coming in. Give me a second here. No. Okay, no more. I'm still going to have to rely on the bank of questions we've had before. Somebody asked a question, I think it was Connor, asked a question concerning mouthfill, cheek fill, mouthfill, and he does BTV, hands-free equalization. Do I really need mouthfill? The answer is very simply, how deep do you want to go? And the second answer is, how flexible are you? You can extend your range without mouthfill a very considerable amount, and I'd hesitate to put a figure on it, if you have thoracic flexibility. Again, we talked, I think, last week about ball exercises, chest opening exercises, and all the yogic back bends. Take a look at the classic yogic back bends and understand what part of the back is their prime focus, and try and work on lower back, middle back, and upper back. Most men are very, very stiff in the upper part of the back. They may have some degree of flexibility in the lower back, and this can develop very easily as a compensatory measure into hyperflexibility, which is not a good idea for the back. You want to try and get an even bend in the back. Flexibility, let me remind you, is incredibly important for two things. One is it's very important for depth. The more flexible you are, the better off you're going to be in adapting to deep water pressures. Quite simply, we all of us have, if you like it, a stretch receptor point. When we go down, we get pressure on the thorax. Okay, thorax is getting blood shift. Lungs, if you like it, or the alveoli are collapsing, the capillaries are dilating. But basically where the thorax is under pressure. Now, at a certain point, what tends to happen is that It's rather like if somebody is pushing you. The first instinct is to push back. If you push back against the water, in other words, tense up, that's the end of equalization. Just doesn't work after that. So, in other words, you've got to look on the water squeezing you as a friend. But there will come a point when your body, we call these pressure trigger points, when your body says, hey, that's enough. That doesn't mean that it's enough for your physiology for the rest of your life. What it means is, right at the moment, in this state of your training, it's enough. Respect it. You want to go further, you're going to have to train it. That means more exposure to that same depth and more flexibility training. The two go hand in hand. Now, if you want more exposure to the same depth, quite a very good way is, of course, what we call drops. Variable weight, which is just holding on to a weight belt in which there could be, let's say, 12 kilos, depending on what thickness of suit you've got on, and dropping with that.
Head down.
Head down position. The weight belt is, of course, attached to a rope, and the rope, of course, should be tied off at your target depth. Don't forget to tie the rope off, particularly if you're over a bottomless sea. Not recommended. But tie the rope off, I don't know, 50 meters, 55 meters, whatever it happens to be that you're going for. And you can practice several drops like that in a session. Of course, the deeper you go, the greater the risk of decompression sickness, and you may only do one repetition. I think it's possible, without too great a risk, to do as much as 2 drops to, let's say, 70 meters. 80 meters, 1 drop. But over a space, even if you're not doing it every day, if you're doing it every other day or something like that, drops, you will build up a tolerance to pressure and depth. You can make it a little bit more realistic for yourself because, of course, you haven't got a weight belt on for this. Or neck weights, for that matter. You're just going down with the weight, with the 12 kilo weight belt, and you're coming up by either finning, swimming, or pulling up, depending on what discipline you're preparing for. You can make it a little bit more realistic by adding, when you've done this the target depth several times, you can start adding a little bit of weight around your neck. Maybe half a kilo at first. Until you build up to whatever you plan to use during your actual competition or record attempt. So that way, really, I'm building up to doing perhaps 2/3 of the dive. Let's look at that exercise because it's an extremely good one for getting used to pressure and depth. The first thing is that the last part of the descent is going to be quick. You're losing buoyancy. You don't have any kind of brakes or anything, so you're going a bit quicker. You should be weighted in such a way that you're not going much more than 2 meters a second. And at the absolute tops. But it's good training for also getting your equalization going like that, very, very quickly, instantaneously. and being aware of the rhythm that you need to maintain for it. So it has that element to it. It has the element of, so in other words, your descent is all about, you can say, equalization and getting used to, getting your body used to pressure. The ascent, okay, it's very easy at first if you've got no weights, which gives you a lot of confidence, by the way, a lot. It's a nice feeling. It's fun. It really is. You get to enjoy it. You get off on the thing. At first, it may be a bit alarming because you say to yourself, "Hey, wait a minute! I've got no control. I've got no brakes. What happens if I go too far?" All this kind of nonsense goes on in your head. Actually, you do have control because you can do what we call slip and hold. Slip, yeah, where I allow the line to pass through my hand and then hold again. And then allow more line to slip and hold. Okay, I won't get to the final depth that I've marked off. But I only do that if I really need to buy a little bit more time for equalization. It's okay to cheat that way at first. Yeah, but try and discard it as soon as you can. Then, when it comes to adding little bits of weight for the ascent, you know something? I've built nearly at least 2/3 of the dive right here. And if my fitness is up and if my breath holds okay, it's a very good training. I'm pretty much ready for doing deep diving. So it's a really good tip to work on that stuff. It does require teamwork. It does require a lot of special safety precautions. It's much easier to manage if people are diving out of a boat. Diving from any kind of a float or platform can be more problematical because the one thing that you really, really want to avoid is somebody getting tangled in a slack rope. So be very well aware of that one. So that's so much for that one at the moment. I didn't really put a precise number on. Connor wanted an answer to how deep can I go without a mouthfill on BTV. Basically, a lot of that is going to depend on how flexible you are and how deep you want to go. I wouldn't recommend trying to go to 100 meters on it, but you can probably add a few meters to what you've got at the moment. And the chest flexibility is going to prepare you and make all your deeper dives a lot more comfortable. It's really something worth investing some time in. Okay, another check on questions. Right.
Nothing so far. We are waiting for your questions. There are no stupid questions. If there's something not clear, please don't hesitate.
So I don't know whether you heard that, but do ask questions or at least give us pointers to what you particularly like dealt with. Otherwise we start going over the same old ground time after time. So one of the things, somebody asked me also about breathwalk. They tend to reach a plateau. Again, about breathwalk, let me just say a few things here. I described the breathwalk before. I went over all the business about how you should look at your heart performance during the breathwalk, what it could be anticipated to being in the 3 stages or 4 stages of the breathwalk. Very briefly, what I said is that at the end of ventilation, It might be, on the other hand, it might not. It might be as high as 80 beats a minute. That shouldn't frighten anybody. Because actually in the water it's going to go down anyway. It's really, you don't have to worry about what your heartbeat is on the surface. The water's going to do it all for you. But we're talking about the breath walk at the moment. The next stage, the next time you take your heartbeat is going to be at the end of the static phase. Now, just before you get up and walk. We said that that could drop in an elite diver to anything from 45 to 60, from 80. And a lot of that will depend on how much tachycardia you've got and how much bradycardia you've got. Tachycardia means that the moment you hold your breath, your pulse immediately starts to go up, actually. And then after a time, it goes down. Now, how much it's going to go down will depend on how long you're holding your breath and how long your tachycardia phase is. However, let's go to the next thing. The next time that you're going to be checking your pulse is just at the end of the breath walk, just before you stop, just before you take the first breath. And the fourth time, and that could drop, I've seen it drop in elite divers to 28 at the end of a walk. Believe it or not, a well-trained diver, his pulse actually goes down when he's walking. It really starts to go down only in the last 10% of the walk. Then it shoots up the moment he is in recovery. And it can shoot up to, let's say, 115 or however. It depends how stressed the breath walk is. The more stressed it was, the more effort he's put into it, the higher the pulse is going to go up. So, so let me come to this. The more advanced you are with the breath walk, the least number of repetitions you do. What you're aiming for is being able to do your maximum breath walk without even any static apnea warm-up before it. Just few breaths. Hold your breath for the static period that you've designated for the walk, and then, still holding your breath, get up and walk. And if you're at a very high level, that's to say what dry training for, let's say, 100 meters, which would mean that you were doing a minute 20 static, and you were doing 2-minute walk after it, still holding your breath. So for a sum total of breath hold there, being 3 minutes 20 seconds. That's a minimum, or 3 minutes 40 seconds, even better. You're walking another 20 seconds. Okay, a walk like that, you'd only do 1 repetition, and that's it. So in other words, what we do is we may start by doing 4 repetitions, but as we progress, we will reduce, not increase, we will reduce the number of repetitions until finally, when we're at a high level, sorry, my voice is going, we only do a single repetition. Again, you do not want to do this more than twice a week. If you do, you're going to be very soon a victim of overtraining. Sorry about this, I should have swallowed half a pot of honey before I began. Okay, so in other words, look, that's fine for that exercise. But what happens if we're doing another breath hold exercise? I do not recommend doing more than 2 maximum breath holds, whether one is static and one is dynamic, or both are dynamic, or both are static. I don't recommend doing more. When you're at a high level, I don't recommend doing more than twice a week. And that is maximum. And you might work, depending on how long it is, you might work on 1 week you do 2 repetitions, and the next week you only do 1. Sorry, I'm being offered a bit of honey here to try and clear my throat. I'll either choke to death on it, or maybe it'll have some result. So this is it. Really, there's too many sad stories about overtraining. It happens all the time. This is where people lose interest in freediving. And they lose it both in the short term and in the long term. In the short term, it's very, very frustrating because you suddenly find that there's a wall in front of you that you can't get past. The natural tendency is to try and train more or more intensively, which is exactly wrong, and you even start going backwards even quicker. Okay. Result: depression, frustration, lack of self-worth, even can interfere with appetite, sleep, and all the other bad things. So please try and avoid that one. There are plenty of exercises we can do that teach all kinds of things without maximally stressing the system. A very valuable exercise that I learned in India when studying Pranayama there, which I might use for a preparation before a maximum attempt at static, is an exercise called anaerobic. Basically what you're doing is, it's the first exercise, the first thing that if you have a very good pranayama master in India, usually he won't even talk to you until you can sit, until you can sit for half an hour in one of the classic positions where you're in one of the classic positions where your knees are actually touching the floor. Then, when you've mastered one of these positions that you can sit in what we call Padmasana, the lotus position, Vajrasana, Virasana, Baddha or Siddhasana. Siddhasana is usually for those people who are celibate. The next thing is just breathing through both nostrils, in as slowly as you can and out as slowly as you can. Now this has a little catch to it. If I breathe in as slowly as I can, let's say at the beginning for 15 seconds, and I breathe out, for 20 or 25 seconds. But when I go to breathe in again, the breath is jerky. Then he'll say to you, quicken up your breathing. You're trying to push it. You're trying to get there too quickly. Don't do that. Main thing about sitting is that the spine has to be absolutely straight, the shoulders back and down, and the knees on the floor. If you really can't do this, lie down on the floor, on your back, on a hard surface, have a small board or 2 boards behind your head, and maybe a board half as thick under the chest. Now, in India, what they do is that they measure the idea is to have what they call the short breath. The short breath being that the breath is only felt a very short distance from the face. Of course, if you breathe out forcefully, yeah, without control, you're going to feel that a long way away from your face. But what they try and do is this: they hang in front of your face a feather or a piece of silver foil on a thread
To see if it moves while Aaron is breathing, I'll explain. To see how far the feather moves from his face.
to see what angle that maintained at and at what distance it's felt from the face. They actually measure that by finger widths from the face. So what they mean by the short breath is that it's nearly indiscernible more than a very short distance away from the face. So the breath must be smooth, it must flow without interference, without pauses between inhalation and exhalation in this exercise. And no attempt to try and make the exhalation twice as long as the inhalation. This is one of the white elephants in freediving that I really have exception to. First of all, we all know that your heartbeat does go down during the exhalation phase. But even if your exhalation phase was twice as long as your inhalation phase, the moment you start inhaling, it goes back up again anyway. So what's the point? Cumulatively, not with everybody does it go down. All our bodies are different. The less we interfere with the body, actually the body's wisdom takes over, and the less we think about that, the more the body's wisdom is allowed to operate and will guide us to what the ideal proportion between inhalation and exhalation for us is. And this is a very important thing. Don't force it. Don't try to force patterns on yourself that are not natural. You may find during that exercise, we after 2 months in India were doing 60 breaths an hour, emptying myself. She was also, I have to admit, 8 months pregnant at the time. So it was a very fine performance for her. I have to claim Anno Domini as an excuse for not doing better than that. But 60 breaths an hour, keeping it up for an hour, and keeping it 100% smooth. If we'd gone on for the full 5 months that single exercise should take, you can get to a very high standard, and without holding your breath, you have trained the lowering of the metabolism and inurement to CO2, big time. And all that without actually holding your breath. So I think that that's a very valuable exercise. Erika Shagatai was talking over this exercise with me a few months ago, mentioned that she thought it was probably a very good exercise for also washing out residual CO2 in the muscles. Maybe she's right. Whatever, I found it very effective into putting me into exactly the zone and exactly where I wanted to be. That, I mean, before a static attempt or something like that, I would lie down, find a quiet corner, do 30 very, very slow breaths, not move around much afterwards, and do a minimal warm-up, and go straight into the performance. And it produced for me the best results. Give it a shot. Let me know how it works for you. It's a tremendous tip.
In case they haven't seen on the camera.
Okay, in case any of you didn't see that little illustration about the feather or the piece of silver foil suspended on a thread, it should look, hang on a second, very bad at organizing this in front of the thing, it has to go up a bit, should look something like that. Okay, Alina's done me a very nice drawing of that, which shows you can detect any movement of air very easily and very measurable distance from the face. So you can monitor your own performance on that. One last little tip on that one, if you're doing that exercise, you do get into the zone and you tend to lose track, because the one thing that you should do, and this is something I can't emphasize enough, is you should maintain a log of what you're doing. Write down every time, every single exercise that you do. Write up exactly what you did, how many breaths you did in, well, let me put it the other way around. If you're doing this exercise, you begin by doing only 15 breaths, and every time you do this exercise, you add a breath up to 60. You don't go above 60 in this. By that time, you're just lengthening and lengthening and lengthening the actual breath of how long it takes. So, number of breaths, how long the overall performance take. Do not try to time each breath. That's counterproductive. Just 15 breaths took, I don't know, 20 seconds or whatever it is. I'm just throwing out a number stupidly. And write that down in your book. Write down how you slept. You did do it on an empty stomach, what time of day you did it. Write down any comments you can, and you'll find these extremely valuable, because if something needs changing in your program, that's where you've got all the information stored, and you will forget things if you don't write them down. I'm going to tell you that now. And then when it comes to changing your own program and being your own coach, you're going to be in the dark. So your logbook is the most important factor. Last tip, in order to count the number of breaths, I found that the Indian method is much more effective than laying out matches or beads or anything else. They count the creases in their hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and then on the other hand. So both hands, you get up to 24 repetitions. So you can work out how many hands you did very, very easily. And if you're, it's a very easy way and a very good way of maintaining control of how many breaths you actually did in performing that single exercise. It's really a kind of a secret weapon, this one, because it really does produce some incredible results, this exercise. So the first thing is, let's go back. You've got your anaerobic training, which is getting you in condition. You've got your breath hold training. During the winter, you should have flexibility training, which is going to help you in your inurement to pressure and depth. And during that time, if you've got a dive pit of 4 meters or access to water of 4 meters depth, you can do your empty lung exercises. We have incredible tables for that. Um, and so that's all important stuff in preparation for the great summer coming on. Now, the next thing is, if you want to go to a trainer at any stage, any trainer worth his while is the first thing he's going to ask you is, what are your objectives and how? The next thing is, he's going to want to know where you're at today and how you've been training today. So, logbook, guys. It's really an absolutely invaluable tool. Write up everything that you do in the logbook. Write up your diet. Write up how you slept. Write up how long you slept. Write up, even count your glasses of water during the daytime. Yeah? In Eilat, the English beer mug is probably your best friend. Not for beer, for water. Regrettably not for beer, but for water it certainly is, and it's really necessary. So there's the Russian version, or your very good health, yeah, the British version of the beer mug for water here. Wow, that honey did do wonders for my throat. Apologize for that. This has been recorded. We look forward to seeing you next week. We hope that those who missed it and who are interested can pick up on a recording. And if you want me to stop repeating myself, please bring in any questions that you like. Yeah, it can be on equipment, it can be on training. And if I don't hear anything else, next week I'm going to talk about mental training. Not next week, it'll be actually on the 27th of March, will be the next webinar in English. And
those of you who know Hebrew, it's going to be next week.
And anyway, for those of you who speak Hebrew, we have a Hebrew version coming up next week. It's always 1 week Hebrew, 1 week in English. The next subject that we're going to be talking about is one of the all-important subjects of mental training. And we hope you've enjoyed it tonight. So from us at the Freedivers, we thank you very much for joining us, and we wish you a very, very good evening, and we hope to see you all again on the 27th. Bye for now.